Welcome to Scigest, your fortnightly science from the Bioeconomy Science Institute.
Kia ora, ko Nicola Sulivan tēnei. Nau mai, haere mai, and welcome to another Scigest episode. Every year in Aotearoa, New Zealand, about 3,400 wildfires burn some 5,700 hectares of rural land. These fires can be devastating, so understanding their behaviour to inform response is vital. That's where the Bioeconomy Science Institute Maiangi Taiao's fire researchers come in. They develop tools to help firefighters and communities prepare for and respond to wildfires and build awareness of the risks so people can prepare for and cope with their impact. Fire ecologist Shana Gross is here to tell us more. Kia ora, Shana.
Kia ora, Nicola.
Tuatahi, can you tell us what your role is at the Bioeconomy Science Institute Maiangi Taiao and what it involves?
Yeah, so I am a fire ecologist and I oversee all the wildfire research that goes on at the BSI. So that involves identifying kind of research and science priorities, overseeing the science that is conducted, outreaching to stakeholders and the public and community about what that means, translating that science into action and education.
Can you give us a definition of a wildfire?
Yes, sure. So a wildfire is any unplanned fire that's happening in the natural environment. And so that fire could have started from a planned cause but then escaped, or it could have happened unintentionally. And it burns the natural environment, which can include forests or grasslands or scrublands.
And sort of about how many wildfires do we have in Aotearoa, New Zealand? And are there some areas that are more prone to wildfires?
So in your lovely introduction, you identified the number of wildfires an area burned, and that's the average that has been over the past 30 years. But sometimes we have more fires or less fires. We burn more area than other years. And that all has to do with the fire danger when everything aligns to burn. And so yes, some regions are more susceptible to fire, and those are areas that tend to be drier, and therefore things are more easy to burn, or areas where there's high winds or high temperatures. And while the total number of fires an area burned is important, it's also important that even in a year where we have a very small number of wildfires relative to past years, or a small area burned relative to past years, the impact from different wildfires can change. And so we might have a ton of wildfires in a year, but maybe they didn't burn the same areas of significance. Like in this past year, the Tongariro National Park burned. And that's quite significant due to the values at that site, but it was actually a really small wildfire year in general.
And are wildfires a part of our natural ecology like they are in Australia? Or have they sort of increased, I guess, with human habitation?
So between 97 to 99% of the wildfires in New Zealand are human caused. And the number of wildfires has increased globally, and a lot of that increase is because of humans. But New Zealand has a different ecology and disturbance regime than other places overseas, in that when lightning strikes, which is the primary natural reason for wildfires, it often comes with a lot of rain here. Whereas if you have a fire in Australia or in the United States, these large continental climates, when fires happen with lightning, it's often quite dry. And so that's why the fires start there. So lightning-caused fires are not part of New Zealand's natural disturbance regime. Historically, before human arrival, fires would start from volcanic activity. So volcanoes can start fires, and there's large areas that have burned, especially on the North Island, due to wildfires. But the period between wildfires is significantly longer, whereas when you have these frequent lightning fire regimes, you actually have a frequent fire return interval. But in New Zealand, that fire return interval is quite long, and so the native forests aren't adapted to the same amount of fire as elsewhere.
Because they have longer in between to recover and establish again.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. How long has the Bioeconomy Science Institute Maiangi Taiao and its predecessors been researching wildfires?
Wildfire has been a research area for over 30 years, which is really cool. I've only been with the Bioeconomy Science Institute for about 4 years now, but there was many people before me who started studying wildfires, and we have 30 plus years of data looking at wildfire.
Wow.
So a long history.
Yeah, impressive. And from the decades of studying rural and forest fire behaviour, what are the key pieces of information that your team's science has provided to help incident managers respond to fire?
That's a great question. So 30 plus years ago, what the team did was they brought the New Zealand fire danger rating system essentially to New Zealand. And that's how we evaluate what the fire danger is going to be. If you've ever heard of the fire weather index or anything like that associated with wildfire, that was all brought over from a Canadian forest fire danger rating system, translated and adapted for New Zealand ecosystems. So that was one of the foundational pieces of work, and then we've been building on that over those years by improving our fuels models and therefore our fire behavior understanding around New Zealand fuels versus Canadian fuels, because that's where we adapted it from, and updating kind of the weather for New Zealand conditions.
And when you say fuels, is that anything that could burn in a fire?
Yeah, so fuels collectively is just what fuels that fire. It's anything that can burn. And so in a wildfire, it's largely vegetation, but it can also include structures. And when we think of fuels, we think of everything from the surface fuel, so what's on the ground, all the way up into the tree canopies and how that fuel is arranged. So if you have different layers of fuel, if you have grasses and shrubs and trees, would have a different fire behavior than if you just have maybe some grass or if you just have some trees. And so fuels is a very generic term for what can burn, but it covers that complex ecosystems and, vegetation communities, which include anthropogenic structures and other pieces that can also burn.
And that science forecast model that you were talking about, does that include those roadside signs that you see that have the indication of fire risk for that season?
Yes, there's been a lot of work with the team on those roadside signs, working with Fire Emergency in New Zealand. All of our work is very closely linked to the Rural Fire Authorities and Fire Emergency New Zealand now. And so there is some of the underlying science behind those signs, but then there's also been a lot of work from the social science aspect of, do people understand what those signs mean? And New Zealand, we have a couple different of the grapefruit signs where we have the fire danger, but we also have if it's okay to light a fire. And so I don't think that it always connects when someone is driving by those signs of what that sign is actually saying at that time. So sometimes is it okay to have a fire without a permit, or can you only have it in the permit season? Sometimes it's about fire danger. Most of those signs are updated, but some of them take a while to change that sign, and fire danger can actually change throughout the day. And so it's important to not just rely on those signs. They give you a general understanding of the region and what that fire danger would be.
Is that social science quite a key part of the wildfire research?
Yeah, so social science has always been a key part of the science that we've done around wildfire research. I don't know if it's gone back 30 years. I'm trying to think of what I've seen. I wasn't here 30 years ago, so I don't know. But there's a lot of work done around community preparedness and how people, like awareness, and really to help translate that information so that people are prepared in emergencies and understand what different things mean. So that social aspect at the community level has been happening for over a decade. And recently, a lot of the social science has focused on planning and so moving just from that community level up to, the regional or city council level, and then all the way up to national level about what does it mean to be prepared for wildfire.
Your team have completed over 140 experimental burns across different vegetation types. How have the findings from those burns changed how we understand their behaviour?
They've been really essential to understanding fire behavior. As I mentioned earlier, our models are adapted from Canadian systems. And so while there's some similarities in the vegetation, there's a lot of differences too. And so what the experimental burns allow us to do is actually track wildfire under kind of a controlled environment. It's never fully controlled, but where we have a lot of instrumentation. And so we can understand how fast the fire moves. So that's the rate of spread. We can understand how hot that fire got. That's the intensity during these different conditions. And when we build these fuel models to predict fire behavior, you need to understand what is burning, so the fuels, what the weather was, so that's going to drive how it burns, and then that resulting fire behavior. And so the experimental burns provide us additional data points to actually develop these models. And so when there is a fire in systems that we have a lot of knowledge about, we can say under these conditions, we expect this fire to move this fast, or we expect this fire to burn this hot. And that's really important for translating to how are we going to fight the fire? Where are we going to be safe? Where is it going to move to? And all of that. And so essentially to build these fuel models, they're built by a series of observations from wildfires or expert knowledge just from being somewhere, or experimental burns. And really those experimental burns are the foundation of that information. And we don't tend to get on those very extreme conditions because it's hard to light a fire under extreme wildfire conditions. And that's where collecting information on actual wildfires is really important. So we gather more information on a bit of the lower fire danger aspects so we can build those curves to understand that spread and intensity.
So that sounds like some very fun and interesting field experiments. Like, how do you and your team actually go about doing those experimental burns and setting them up?
Yeah, so it's fun. It's a lot of work, and it's a big team. For the actual design of the burns, we have a long history of working with the U.S. Forest Service and recently University of Canterbury with designing the burns and collecting the data. We work with the local fire authority, so Fire Emergency New Zealand right now, to make sure it's safe. We have safety plans. We have a burn plan of how we're going to ignite, when we're going to ignite. We model the different conditions we're looking for and for the target questions we're asking, and then we identify the different weather that we want to burn under to answer those target questions. And for some of the burns, we have had helicopters for additional safety. We build fire lines around the burns so that those fires don't escape. Everyone who's on the burns has been trained to be a firefighter, so they're aware of safety. We have safety zones. And so that's all the kind of that operational aspect, which takes a lot of planning. And then on the burn, we also have a lot of instrumentation. And so we have gridded temperature loggers, essentially, that measure that fire temperature. We have weather towers where we can measure wind and pressure and atmospheric conditions. We have LiDAR, so we can actually see both vegetation but also LiDAR that tracks the wind patterns. We have drones out there flying. We have different cameras set up in special housing that can withstand the temperature of the flames. Wow. We have quite a bit of instrumentation out there, which you don't get to put out on a wildfire. Like a wildfire, when you respond, it's mostly observation. You talk about the flame height, whereas on an experimental burn, we have measuring sticks so we can see how high that flame got. And so we get better refinement of that data when we plan that burn. And we also have, before the burn, we take a lot of data on the fuels, so we know that structure and the biomass of the fuels there, so we can translate how much fuel is burning to that intensity.
And when you say that you study wildfires that burn, of their own ignition, that aren't experimental, does that mean that a lot of your research, your team is sort of on call, that if a wildfire starts, you need to go out and start analysing what's happening?
Yeah, so over the last 30 years, the team has been on call for wildfires, and they've also been part of the wildfire team, and they'll be modeling fire behavior for the fire agencies to help them do operational stuff. And currently, we've been working on developing kind of a rapid deployment protocol so that we are collecting data in the same way, because each wildfire is unique. There's so much variability. The wind might move in this direction, or the temperature is this. The fuels are never identical. And so each of these case studies, collectively, we can start answering a lot of questions. So we're developing these protocols. So if a wildfire starts, we can be deployed rapidly, and we have kind of a checklist of, this is the key gaps. This is where we need to have more information. And a lot of it is in fuels that don't burn as much. So those would be our native forests, like to really identify when those fires do burn, what is the intensity of those burns, and then you can actually think about the recovery of those sites as well, because oftentimes one of the missing pieces of information from wildfires when people are looking at kind of the trajectory of ecosystems or something is actually how hot did that burn? How fast was it moving? How long did the fire stay in one place and just kind of smolder? And so that information actually helps us develop better models on both fire behavior and then also thinking long-term of the trajectory of that site because a fire went through.
I understand there's a lot of tool development underway, from online fire behaviour models right through to field equipment improvements like sensors and temperature probes. Which innovation is likely to make the biggest difference for responder safety in the next few years, and why?
Yeah, that's such a hard question. I actually reached out to some folks on my team because when I saw the question, it's like, oh, how do you pick one tool? Because everything is really about being more aware so you can be prepared. So you are not being reactive. You're actually proactively understanding the fire. But if I had to just pick one tool, well, I'll pick two.
Yeah, go for it.
So we've been doing a lot of work around hotspot detection with thermal cameras either on the helmet or on a shovel. And so one of the things that people do kind of on the tail end of a fire is what's called mop up, and they're putting out hotspots where there's still a lot of heat in the ground. And oftentimes firefighters will just put their back of their hand on the ground or something to see, is it hot? And when you miss these hotspots, that's actually when you have reignition. So it's really important to detect them. But with the use of a thermal camera, which are used for other aspects, and you can actually see the heat on the ground, so you're not having to physically put your hand on it. So that's good. And we have some prototypes that people have been testing and using. One of the things that we are developing in this next year, or starting to, is look at ember transport. So that is when essentially you have a tree burning and a piece of the leaves or the bark or something flies and moves in the wind, and then it starts another fire. And so people can be trapped in between these different fires, and it also is the cause of fires getting quite large. And it's a big problem over in Australia, where you have eucalypts and their bark is always flying great distance. And so what we're doing in this next year is looking at if we can use these wind transport models to predict where different embers might land. And that's a frequent problem in New Zealand. There was some fires in Kaikoura less than a year ago. Maybe it was just over a year ago, and essentially those fires moved between hedges, so they weren't traveling. Most of the fire behavior models are about just radiant heat moving on the ground in a plane, whereas these were actually spotting between hedges. And so this wind ember transport model should work really well. Like, the theory is there, and what it would allow firefighters to do is to, based on the winds and those microscale wind patterns, which are affected from, trees and hedges and all sorts of things at that microscale, where would those embers actually move to? And then someone can be there ready to put it out if it actually lands. And so I think that will improve firefighter safety, so people aren't kind of caught unexpectedly, and hopefully reduce fire sizes.
They both sound very useful tools. Your team have recently updated a manual for predicting fire behaviour across a range of fuel types and weather conditions. How does that kind of behind-the-scenes science get used on the fire ground?
Yeah, so the Orange Manual, which is this fuels and fire behavior manual that you're talking about, it's called Orange Manual because it has an orange cover, and so that's just how it's collectively referred to, is kind of the collective of all the science that we've been doing, and it really is kind of like a firefighter's Bible, really, in predicting where that fire is going to move. So how fast is it going to move? How intense is it going to be based on what is burning, the weather? And so it is a series of different kind of worksheets or equations that firefighters who are on the ground can look at to predict. And it really helps plan tactics, so where firefighters might be located based on the weather conditions and the fuels, and it helps keep people safe because they're not just guessing, they're actually using that foundational science to predict where that fire is going to move. How big of a fire break do you actually need to stop the fire from crossing it? Different things like that.
And you're working with partners, including NASA, I understand, and ANU, Australian National University, and Fire and Emergency New Zealand, on a near real-time fuel moisture and fuel type system. What would near real-time mean in practice for an incident controller and for a community trying to prepare?
Yeah, that's a great question. So near real-time in this sense for fuel moisture will be every 2 to 3 days. There'll be essentially the tool will be a spatial map that on a 25 to 30 meter grid size cell, what is the fuel moisture at that point? And what that helps identify is how likely, if a fire was to start, will it burn in that fuel. So if you picture a well, like watered yard of green grass, it will take a lot to burn that because it's quite wet. But a dry grass that hasn't been watered all summer could burn quite readily. And so this is a project where we're using satellite data, and we are developing a model based on field collections of leaves that we then weigh and put in the oven to dry to identify how much moisture was in it. So we're correlating that fuel moisture with the satellite imagery to identify fuel moisture across the landscape, which then translates to how easily will a site burn. And ultimately, those fuel moisture values can be inputted into our fire spread models to help improve our spread predictions.
Wow, sounds cool. And so you've talked about the embers moving and the tool that you're developing to map that. And I assume that some of that is when the embers reach the canopy, right? And when the fire goes into the canopy. What changes operationally once a fire transitions to a canopy fire? And how are you tackling that prediction gap when it would become a canopy fire?
So our models right now are on surface fire spread, but we know that fire moves into a canopy when there's fuels available. And so we're tackling that in a number of ways. One is by improving knowledge of what fuel is on the ground and the kind of that layered structure. Because if you have a lot of fuel between the ground to the canopy, and by fuel I mean maybe branches, so that fire can actually go up to the treetops, what happens is that you have a lot more fuel that is burning, so you have a lot hotter fire. And when you have more intensity, you need different firefighting tactics, and that's often when you would switch to needing air resources to act, because your flames are taller and they're hotter, and so you can't put people on the ground by that. And so we are always trying to improve our fire behavior models in any way we can, and that's part of the fuel moisture reason, to actually understand when could that fire move into the canopy, because often this is especially true in our native forests. If you think about, the surface is often quite wet, and when the surface is wet, the canopy is often quite wet. But at some point there's that dry point where maybe the surface burns, but maybe it doesn't move into the trees. But at some point it will move into the top, and then it's just high intensity, and you can get a lot more ember transport from the trees.
Yeah. One thing we haven't talked about yet is smoke. And smoke can be one of the biggest health impacts, right, of a fire. So how do your smoke and fire behaviour modelling tools support public health advice and on-the-ground response during an event?
Yeah, so smoke is a hazard both from public health, like you said, and also from ability to see, because if you have a lot of smoke, it can actually be hard to drive because you can't see through the smoke, and hard to have a watch out or look out so that you can see where the fire is moving. And so we have something on our website that's called the Fire Registry, which models smoke from wildfires that are detected from satellites. And it also models the fire behavior, but you need a special login for the fire behavior. The team also does kind of bespoke smoke modeling. So if there is an incident, then Fire Emergency will call us and ask about us to do a special smoke model. And so we incorporate information about the weather, so you can think about the transport, where that smoke would move, but also about the area that's burning, like what the fuels are in that area that's burning, so that we can think about how many particulates are in the air. And so then that translates to kind of the health hazard. And luckily, in general, New Zealand air quality is really amazing. So it's pretty mild, but the development of the smoke modeling came about during the Australian Black Summer fires, where there was so much smoke over in New Zealand. It was actually really hazardous here too, the conditions. And so we model both New Zealand fires detections as well as Australian fire detections.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that because I remember the smoke from those Australian fires, and I remember on New Year's Day the sun was like this amazing red from all the smoke that had come over. Yeah, it was quite stark.
Yeah.
When people hear wildfire risk, they often think it's only climate change that impacts that. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, how do climate, land use, fuels, human activity, how do they each contribute to wildfire hazards?
Yeah, so they all contribute to wildfire, and that's, I think, one of the reasons it is kind of exciting to study wildfire, because there's so much variability and always something new to learn, and it's not just climate change. So that, to some extent, is a bit oversold. It's definitely a hazard, and the future is changing, and we need to be aware, and we need to be looking at that. But right now, it's really about the weather and what the current weather is. And when we have hot days or we've had long periods of drought, then yes, things are going to burn more. And so in the future, if we get hotter days, longer periods without rain, drought, climate change is important. Really, because 97-99% of fires are started by humans, human dynamics are so important, and how humans move, increases in population translate to increased ignition likelihood or ignition pressure. Most of the wildfires that happen over here are around like larger population centers where people can access areas. So in order to start something, someone has to be able to get there in most cases, or be doing some activity that inadvertently starts a fire, just from a spark on a car along the side of the road or something. And then you have land use change, which is really important. So it's not just the change from having more people, but also if you change from a forest to a grassland, that changes that potential fire hazard, because now if that grassland dries, you actually have a much more rapidly spreading fire that can ignite a lot easier, versus a forest, which actually can be really challenging to ignite because of the moisture that's being held in it. But when it does ignite, it has a lot more fuels that can burn, so it's a lot higher intensity. And so these interacting dynamics are really important. And I guess when we think about future climate, what we're missing just by thinking about the climate is actually how the vegetation changes. So if we have major changes in temperature and moisture, you would expect a change in the plant species that are there. And so that would then affect that fire hazard. So it's actually quite complex. And I think it depends on where people are, largely.
Thinking about the different fuel types and the different vegetation types, does your team offer advice on what plant types people should plant in different areas in order to reduce fire risk?
To some extent, yes. There's still a lot of unknowns, and so we do have some work around there, and we're always available to answer questions, but it's really often site specific, and it's not just single species. It can be the combination of species. So if you think about how a fire moves and you are just planting a single species, when that species can burn, all those individuals would burn. Whereas if you have complexity and diversity in your stand, maybe you have some plants that are more likely to burn, but everything around it isn't. And so there's actually this kind of dynamics piece, and people will often talk about plant flammability, which is really important, but that's at an individual plant level. And sometimes some of that work is at an individual shoot level, which might not translate to what that plant looks like in the field. So maybe if you have very flammable canopy, so the top of the tree, but actually the bark isn't flammable, maybe it's okay. Maybe it's flammable when it's young, but not when it's old. And so we are doing some work in this next year looking at flammability from a structural perspective. So people don't have to know an individual plant, but we're hoping to release a resource where someone can say, this plant I would love to plant has a lot of leaves and they die and they don't go anywhere. Or this plant drops its leaves and those are all in the ground. And so just so people can have that knowledge of how to think about that, not purely just from an individual species perspective. And then it's also important to think about the site conditions for where you want to plant something. So if your site is always wet, maybe that plant would actually hold more fuel moisture. And so therefore, maybe it is a bit more flammable than something else, but that's only if it dries out. And so maybe it's appropriate in some areas. So yes, our team can absolutely work with people and talk about that stuff. It's actually quite complex, and people just want what should I plant? And the danger is someone might plant something everywhere and it might work in some scenarios, but not in everything. And so it's quite complex, like life and everything. Like there's a lot of complexity in there.
Yeah, absolutely. And what would you say the most common misconception about wildfires is and that you'd like to correct?
I think oftentimes people think that forests are where the greatest wildfire hazard is, but I think that is based on when forests burn, they do burn hot and you see them. If you look at the data, most fires have started in grasses. And so grasslands, dry grasses, are actually a very large hazard because they can burn so quickly. And so I guess if there's a fire in a grassland, it's really important for people to know that could spread really quickly. Like maybe don't try to put it out. And forests aren't always the problem. Anything can burn under the right conditions, and there's a narrower window for forests than there is for grasslands of when it would burn.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I guess I would have thought, forest, that's what I think of when I think wildfires. Yeah.
Yeah, and shrubs are even it's kind of like grass, shrubs, forests for how easily they will burn for ignitability, but then the reverse is just forests do have a lot more material, so they'd burn hotter.
Right.
And I think that's a common misconception when people move into an area and they're not by a forest. They think, I don't actually have any fire hazard here. But actually, a spark from a car, if you have train lines around you or something, can easily spread a fire quite quick if you're surrounded by grasslands.
Yeah, so on that, when we're thinking community preparedness and resilience, it's a key goal, right? So what practical advice would you give to people in high-risk areas to help them prepare?
Yeah, I think it's good to be aware that wildfires can happen anywhere. The conditions just have to align. Met Service's little weather app that tells you what the weather is, if you scroll down, it will actually tell you the fire danger for that area. And so that is a really easy way people can just see what is the danger for this area. Maybe it's low, that's based often on a single fuel type, and so it's important to think about that, what is around you. And then Fire Emergency New Zealand has a great amount of resources. If you go to their Check It's All Right page, and it talks about having a preparedness kit and knowing if it's okay to do certain activities. And so I think awareness is the best thing. For any natural hazard, it's good to have that emergency kit. It's not a lot different for an earthquake versus a wildfire, right? Know what you want to take, where your medicines are, and if there is a wildfire in your area, don't necessarily wait to get an evacuation notice, because sometimes if you're going to be evacuated, roads can back up, especially if you live on like a one way in, one way out. So if you see a fire and it's not a planned fire, you might want to think about just voluntarily leaving ahead of time. If you're at all concerned, I would say go for it.
Ngā mihi nui, Shana, for sharing with us your team's important work on the science of wildfires. The practical implications and importance for our whenua and our safety are very obvious, especially with increased wildfire risk in Aotearoa, New Zealand, due to climate change and changes in land use and fuel type and human populations. So thank you, and keep up the good work. And to our listeners, thanks for listening to another Scigest podcast. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe and rate our podcast to let us know how we're doing. You can also email any questions or suggestions to scigest@plantandfood.co.nz. Until next time, thanks for listening. Mā te wā.